Working in the Brown Book right now. This is chapter 7. We're going to talk about literacy in the adult population, not to be confused with literacy in the pediatric population, because some of these things go hand in hand, but others are not. So this is specifically about the adults. There are some definitions that you need to know, and you can look these up in your book, but the simplified version here is that someone is literate if they can read and comprehend at a pretty high level. And you can look at their ability to read and comprehend at various levels, and then you can categorize that. But people either can read or they can't read, and it's not just reading but comprehension that is important. Most of the time in children, they read at one grade level and typically comprehend at one grade level lower. This kind of carries through to adulthood, but as you get older and you become a better reader and a more constructive reader, then your comprehension goes up. So there's sort of a tap out point where you're probably not going to become any better a reader. You know most of the words you're going to know. You know how to look up any words you don't know. You know how to figure out words from the context of the writing, so you very rarely come across words that you don't know. However, your comprehension gets better every time you look up a word in the dictionary. Every time you read a new word or learn how to pronounce a new word, your comprehension goes up. So your comprehension can continue to go up during your lifetime. And the more you read, the higher your comprehension level will be. And the better you'll do in school, the better you'll do in life. Statistics show you'll make more money, you'll get more promotions, and your children will be better off too. So it's all a big domino. But that's what literate is. Illiterate means you can't read, but it's not the same as functional illiteracy. There's most people, especially in the United States, are not completely illiterate. We have a lot of illiterate people, but really we're talking about functional or low illiteracy. And so there's a difference between not being able to read at all and being able to read really super slowly and or not comprehensively. So low literacy means you can read and probably comprehend at the level that you read at. So these are adults that can struggle through a Dr. Seuss book. Functional illiteracy, these people can read at a much higher level. And by much higher level, I use that term loosely. They may still only be reading at the 5th or 6th grade level, but they're not reading at the 2nd or 3rd grade level. However, with functional illiteracy, they don't comprehend well. So they read okay, they don't comprehend. This is a problem that the Clark County School District has had as a whole over the last few years. At some point, 8 or 9 years ago, they switched to a reading program in part of the school, which rendered a whole lot of children functionally illiterate, or at least relatively so. And so this is something that, they don't know until later on when they test. They finally figure it out and they say, oh, we should probably not have done that, but there you go. Health literacy is simply being able to read and understand health literature and where to look for it, things like that. Readability is about the printed material as opposed to the reader. And then, as I've mentioned, comprehension, we've already talked about that. There are a lot of things that can affect readability and comprehension. So readability, again, that's the printed material. The comprehension, that's something within the reader themselves. So if it's the reader, maybe they don't feel well, they need glasses, the light's not good, they don't have access to printed materials. I mean, let's face it, if you live in a shelter, you're probably not carrying encyclopedias around under your arm. So there's various levels of literacy because of your lifestyle, how you live. This is also passed on from parents to children. So if you have parents who don't read, then they tend not to encourage their children to read. And it's funny that even when they try to be great parents or really active in the school, they say they're encouraging their children to read, but every night getting their child to read that half an hour that they have to document for school as part of their homework is like a struggle. They have books. They tell the kids to sit down and read. but in the half an hour, the kid manages to read 2 or 3 pages of a book. It's really just almost a waste of time. It's so very little. But when you look at the big picture, you see parents who are telling the children to do this, but they're not modeling the behavior. And we've learned in previous chapters that modeling is how children learn. So parents who read produce children who read. Parents who read have higher incomes and are more successful in life, and they encourage their children to have higher incomes and be more successful in life simply by virtue of reading. The printed material side of this is pretty vast. It can be that the material is simply not well presented, meaning there are sentences, and they have relative sentence structure, and then there's a capital letter at the beginning and a period at the end, but that doesn't mean it makes any sense. Incorrect words may be used, or it's just not written in a way that flows logically. So it can be just readability. There can be issues with it being the wrong size print. Maybe, like I said, if the reader needs glasses, then you have 2 options there, right? You can either increase the size of the font or give the reader glasses or a magnifying glass. You can fix the reader or you can fix the printed material. Or I suppose you could do both, but you have to do something about that. Sometimes the material is simply boring and you don't want to read it. A couple years ago, I told Tommy he was going to have to read War and Peace. I said, this is great. You'll finish it before you're 10. For the rest of your life, you'll be able to say you read War and Peace before you were 10. We read it and read it and read it. And you know what? It's a boring book. Man, it's horrible. So, after 200 pages that he read, we gave up, and I let him walk away from that. Now, he has a terrible habit of doing that with other books, but it's not that he couldn't read it, and it's not that it didn't flow logically, and it wasn't even that the material was over his head, because some of it was, and what was, we could talk him through, and in that way, he actually gained a lot of comprehension. The bottom line was, it's a boring book about a bunch of people going to war. But they don't actually ever get there, so they're having all kinds of parties and complaining to each other, and I don't know. It was boring. So that's a problem with the printed material. If you're talking about health literature, there's always the problem of jargon or technical terms, and that goes with not just health literature, but if you were reading a manual for a machine that you just bought, maybe you have a new computer manual, you may not understand all the words in there. Even though you are all relatively intelligent, educated people, those are jargon. They're considered jargon, and jargon, by definition, are terms that belong to a specific profession. So there's just lots and lots of different things that affect both the readers and the comprehension and the printed material page. There are a lot of people that we know right outright are at risk. I have posted with this lesson a link to a report about adult literacy in the United States. And I have asked that as part of the discussion board in Unit 6, you comb through that report and tell us what your most surprising find was in there. It can be a statistic, it can be just an anecdote, something that you found interesting. I think that you will all be able to find something, and I would prefer if you all found different things. So I wasn't specific about that on the instructions, but since I know you're all listening to this, there you have it. I want you to all find something different. First come, first serve. Then I want you to look online and find the global equivalent to this. So if you find a statistic about race, for example, and how many people in different races read and are functionally illiterate or truly illiterate, then I want you to look globally and see if those numbers in the United States match up with the global numbers. And that can be part of your discussion too. So we know that racial minorities are certainly at risk, and that's because they come from low socioeconomic areas more often than white students do. And if you come from a low socioeconomic area, you're more likely to go to a lower performing school. You don't have as many resources. Now think about the way schools are set up in this country. Schools run on property taxes. So if you live in Summerlin, for example, with those nice big fancy houses, then the property taxes in Summerlin are higher than the property taxes in North Las Vegas. Since the property taxes are higher, the income to the area is higher, therefore there is more revenue for the school system. So the schools in that neighborhood, in the Summerlin neighborhood, are getting more money out of pocket than the schools in North Las Vegas. I always felt like they should switch that they should say the richest area, now their money goes to the poorest area. The second wealthiest area, your money goes to the second poorest area. Because if you are living in an expensive neighborhood, chances are you had a good education, you are readers, and you're already going to encourage your student, your child, to do that. Also, you're more likely to buy the wrapping paper at the fundraiser. You're more likely to do supportive activities and raise money or donate money to the school. If you have that extra disposable income, that's what you do with it. So those schools, if they got less money, would make up for it in kind, whereas the low socioeconomic schools that don't get the money in the first place, they have no way to recoup that either. And the parents aren't able to support the fundraisers as fully. So it's a big deal. And that's the way we're set up right now. Under this system, which has been in place for hundreds of years, there is no way for someone to go to one of those lower socioeconomic schools and come out with an equal education. Now, at home, you can have parents who force you to read and do extra things. You may have some outstanding teachers that go above and beyond the call of duty, but I'm telling you, those teachers are buying lots of stuff for the classroom out of pocket, and they're spending their own money to give those children a better education. And of course, they're not making that much money to begin with. You guys, all fresh grads right out of school, make twice as much money as most teachers. The teachers in the Clark County School District do not start at $30,000 a year. And remember, they all have to have bachelor's degrees or higher. So they're all paying off student loans too. But if you have students under these circumstances, there is no possible way for them to have an equal education. Because of the neighborhood, because of the family situations that are there, where parents are often working much longer hours than parents who are living in Summerlin, or at least one of the parents is home more often in Summerlin. You're also looking at parents who are likely to be relatively illiterate or functionally illiterate themselves, frequently because they're immigrants or they themselves went to a lower performing school. So we've set up this cycle that is damn near impossible to get out of. And it all goes back to the educational disadvantages that are wrapped around the financial resources in the school, that are wrapped around the property taxes in the neighborhood. So the bottom line is, the nicer your neighborhood, the better your education, the better your school. On top of that, if you live in a lower socioeconomic area, you are more likely to suffer from mental illness, and physical illness also. Not because you necessarily have proportionately a different amount of mental or physical illness than they do in Summerlin. But in Summerlin, they're more likely to go seek treatment because they have the financial ability to do that, and they've always had health insurance. So just now, as more people are getting health insurance, maybe we'll see some of that correct itself. But it's always been a problem in those lower areas because they didn't have access to mental health care and physical health care that they needed to take care of that. The people in the lower socioeconomic areas are certainly more likely to be unemployed, and they're more likely to have the parents are more likely to have dropped out of school themselves, and therefore when their kids drop out of school, they don't really get upset about it. It's kind of frustrating. So it's a big domino effect, but it all starts out with the property taxes. So who's at risk? Everybody who doesn't live in the nice white neighborhood. There are a lot of myths about who is illiterate. There's the myth that they're all slow learners, or mentally disabled, mentally challenged. And that's definitely not the case. Many people who are illiterate are extremely bright. They do frequently have issues like dyslexia, for example. And if you can identify that when a child is really young, then you can't get rid of the dyslexia, but you can certainly teach children how to work around it. They need special training, but we've got really good techniques for these students now, and they can then expend their entire educational career at the same level as their peers who are not dyslexic. This is relatively new. Even in the 80s and into the 1990s, students who were dyslexic didn't necessarily get identified, and if they did, the learning strategies were not perfected yet, and so there were not a lot of good strategies. Sometimes the first strategy you try doesn't work, and you've got to try it a different way. I always appreciate it when students come to me and tell me up front that they're dyslexic, because dyslexic people just sort of think backwards. They think from a different direction than the rest of us. And I can deal with that. That's cool. I can say, fine, if everybody else sees everything from the left and you see it from the right, that's fine. I'll just move my lesson for you over to the right-hand side, and let's see if I can figure out a way to help you, if I know that about them. But there's a stigma attached to it, and frequently they don't want to admit it. So, it is what it is. Hopefully the stigma will begin to dissipate, and students will realize that if they just tell people, then their teachers are more than willing to help them. If their teacher is not willing to help them or go to a little extra effort for them because they're dyslexic, then whoever their teacher is should not be teaching. It's not the student, it's the teacher. There's the myth that you can recognize these people. All you have to do is a simple Google search, and you will find stories of CEOs of big, huge corporations, owners of multi-million-dollar companies, who managed to accrue these great jobs and all this wealth, and they could never read. They were so smart, so intelligent, that they managed workarounds for everything in their life. And it's amazing. It baffles me that those people are so smart that they didn't just teach themselves how to read. But again, they may be dyslexic. Still, it's at that point you think, well, you're that smart, you should have been able to teach yourself. But they probably just didn't think about it. And I think at that point, when you get to be 40, 50 years old and you can't read, well, number one, you've got to feel foolish. And it's probably embarrassing. And at that point, you're probably frightened, and it probably seems like a huge, overwhelming thing, and you've managed to make it through this far in your lifetime. You know what a stoplight looks like. You know how to find a bathroom. You only go to restaurants that have pictures on the menu. You just figure out ways to deal with it, and then at that point, when you're 40 or 50 years old, why would you change it? So, you get that, right? There's a myth that a lot of the people who are illiterate, it's because they dropped out of school, and that's not at all true. I can point to my kid who can already read at, I don't know, like 12th grade level, and he's 9. So if he dropped out of school tomorrow, literacy would not be a problem for him. His mother would be a problem for him, but literacy would not be a problem for him. So one doesn't really relate to the other. Although if you are dyslexic or have other learning disabilities that are not being addressed, you are statistically more likely to drop out of school. And then you still can't read. So those are two different things that sort of add together and have a really bad symbiotic relationship. There's the myth that a lot of the people who can't read are foreign born or ethnic or poor. In fact, it's probably the opposite. Even countries that are, lower than us, if you will. It sounds terrible, but even countries like that, often they have higher reading scores than we do. So at least in their own native language, these people showed up knowing how to read. And they may not be able to read English, but that doesn't mean they can't read. It's, in that case, just the material they're being presented. So, you you have to add into the fact with foreign-born people that they're learning how to read in English. That's not their first language. And having lived with someone who has gone through that transition from, in our case, Italian to English, you can learn how to read the words. The comprehension takes a little longer because you have to link, your mother tongue language with English, and you have to sort of marry all the words together. Plus, English is a really hard language to learn. I don't know if you guys realize that, but internationally, English is one of the more difficult languages to learn because we have so many irregular verbs. Really hard to conjugate a verb. Italian's like that too, but English, they say, is even worse because we also have homophones, things like the words sun, S-U-N, son, S-O-N, some, S-U-M. We have words that are similar. They, in some cases, are pronounced identically, but they have totally different meanings. They don't usually do that in other languages. So on the upside, hey, if you don't speak a foreign language, you all speak English. So you can go learn a foreign language pretty easily. And I expect that's what you'll do next as soon as you finish this class, right? There's a myth that the people who are illiterate may or may not admit that they can or can't read. And that's hit or miss, and that's a personal thing. Some of them don't care if you know. Some of them are almost defiant about it, and some will hide it. So that's individual. To assess how readable something is, there are a number of different scores or scales that you can compare the material to. The Fry Readability Graph Extended is one of the more common ones that's used, and I added Lexile score to the end. That is not in your book, but I added that because that's how we often assess books. If you, I'll tell you what, go to the Lexile website. I think it's just lexile.com. It's easy to find. You could just Google it, and then put in the title of your favorite book, and it will tell you what the Lexile number is. And then put in something more simple, like a Dr. Seuss book, or Dick and Jane, whatever, and then put in something that you're pretty sure is more difficult to read, something like Crime and Punishment, for example. And then that will help you kind of wrap your brain around that. I think the Lexile is important to leave there because if you have children in the Clark County School District, they often use Lexile scores. It's a common way of assessing books scores, and sometimes they'll even graduate children because on the Lexile site they'll have books that are in the 100 level Lexile, 200 level Lexile. They'll have lists. There are lists of these books, and so when a child masters that level, as you can use this in an educational way, you can say, all right, you've mastered all the 200 level books, and we know you can read at the 200 level. Let's give you a 300 level book now and move you up the scale. So you can read about these other scales and scoring methods in your book. It would make a good test question. It would make a good matching question. There are ways to measure how comprehensive a printed material is, and here are a couple of the scores. So if I were doing a matching test question, I could add these and sort of interchange them with the other page. Ooh, I think that's a good idea. Okay, so I've talked a lot, but how does this actually relate to what we're doing? Well, you ought to be able to identify the readability of printed material so that you can pick and choose the appropriate materials for whomever you're teaching, whether it's a student or a patient or a coworker or a colleague. So you need to understand how these materials are assessed so that you know where to go looking for the different material. If you've got someone with lower reading levels, then pictures or videos suddenly become a better option. You can, if you're doing long-term learning, you could go to like the Khan Academy, for example. That's free, and if you haven't spent any time on it, you should go check that out. The Khan Academy is pretty cool because you can teach yourself how to do just about anything, almost any subject. And they've set it up where it has graduated lessons, and it just sort of does it automatically. It's great. So depending on how involved someone wants to be, you could for example, send them to the Khan Academy or one of the online learning resources to help self-learn. They can self-teach with these methods, and then you wouldn't have to do very much. But if you understand how these work, then you can understand how to group things together and give them to the learner in a logical fashion. When in doubt, the default is always the 5th grade reading level. I've mentioned before that this is the level at which they write every newspaper in America, at least, the ones in big circulation. Private little newsletter newspapers or small town newspapers, they may be written at a different level. But generally speaking, they are at the 5th grade level, and that's because most people can comprehend at the 5th grade level. You're dumbing it down for some people, and other people will have to struggle to get there. But that's the default. So when in doubt, with adults, go to the 5th grade level. If you know that your learner that you're working with has low literacy, then you're going to have to alter your strategies to deal with those people. The first thing you have to do is bond with the person and let them know that you're here to help, that you're not going to laugh at them, that you need them to be honest so you can fix their problems. There are organizations in just about every community in the country where volunteers teach adults how to read. They'll pair you up almost like a big brother, big sister sort of thing. They pair up a teacher, and they have already put you through some training courses, but they're minimal. And then they pair you up with some adults. And then you guys set up a time, and the rest is up to the two of you. And you meet at the library or you meet at Starbucks, whatever, and you work through things a little at a time. The classes that the teacher will have taken, and again, I use it loosely because it's like 10 hours worth of training. It's not much at all, but they will have shown you good strategies for how to move people through the process. The first thing you have to do is figure out if they can even identify letters of the alphabet, and do they know what sounds those letters make, and do they know that when you put S and H together, it makes the sh sound, and that doesn't look like what it should be on paper, but that's what it does every time you put those two letters together. So you may have to start at a really low level. If you've got a learner who is at a level that low and you need to give them healthcare information, you need to not be giving them printed literature. You need to move on to videos or pictures. You need to do something else at that point. Because helping them learn to read, they could be dead by the time they learn how to read. You need to make sure that they understand what they're doing. Because that you have to go to this much extra effort and use videos and pictures and things like that, you need to have more manipulatives on hand. If you've got a diabetic patient and you're teaching them how to measure insulin, if they've got a high literacy level and a high rate of comprehension, then you can probably give them printed materials with a picture of a syringe that's graduated with some lines on it, and you can show them another picture of a vial of insulin, and you can say, you push the plunger in, make sure there's no air, you withdraw this much insulin, and then this is how you inject it. You could probably do that without actually having a physical syringe and a bottle of insulin in your hand. If you've got a learner, a patient with very low literacy, though, you need to get out the syringe and the bottle of at least water. You need to get out a bottle that looks like insulin. You're at a different level, and you have to teach them in whatever way is necessary for them to truly learn what they need to know. Once you're pretty sure you've given them all the information and they appear to comprehend, you need to make them restate back to you or demonstrate what they have learned. Make them prove to you that they actually did it. I've said this to a few of you anyway, regarding some of the assignments so far. Prove to me that you actually know how to do it, that you actually did it. Show me. And repetition really helps, especially in these lower literacy groups. I could add the TOEFL test to this list, although it's more of an English language learner test. There are a lot of tests where you can measure how well someone reads. There are lots of tests. These are criterion reference tests for the most part, meaning they've given the test to about 1 billion people, and they have come up generally with a grade level or an age or some other criteria, and they've said at your age, in your circumstance, you should be able to read at X level. There are little bitty tests that are on the internet. I took one last night, as a matter of fact. It was, you guys can probably Google it. It was something like, how many days would it take you to read all of Game of Thrones, the whole series of books? Because they're pretty thick books. By the time I did this test, which had, 3 questions, it said I could read the whole thing in 69 days. So, yeah, probably. But would I want to? I don't know. The idea there is that it was a simple test. It probably is not overly accurate, but it was fun. So there are little things out there that are fun and maybe relatively accurate, maybe not accurate at all. And then there are other things that are really fine-tuned, validated instruments for determining the accuracy of someone's reading level. So here are a few of them. The TOEFL test, TOEFL, is given to foreign students from other countries. So if they come to the U.S. to go to college, we use the TOEFL to determine how well they comprehend English. Because often they can read English, especially if they came from a country where they went to school in English. In Africa, for example, several of the countries school their children in English. Sometimes they also school their children in French. There are many schools in the Philippines where the children are schooled in English, and then they're speaking Tagalog at home or outside of school. So they're often schooled in English, but that doesn't necessarily mean they understand the idioms. So I have a very good friend who's Japanese, and if you met him, he hardly has an accent. He's been speaking English so long that he's completely fluent, but he'll tell you he still doesn't get jokes because they're funny. They're funny to us, but often he doesn't get American humor. The TOEFL looks at little things like that. If we use idiosyncratic language, would the learner, in this case, the college student, will they understand it? So if I make a joke or say something offhanded in class, for example, I just used the words offhanded. If I said offhand and you were from another country, there's a literal translation there, right? Off my hand, as opposed to an offhand comment. If you're American, I trust that you understand what I meant when I said an offhand comment. But chances are, if you're from another country, that had a totally different meaning for you. So the TOEFL helps identify that sort of thing. And it's been pretty well documented that when students come from foreign countries, even if they were schooled in English and are fluent in English, if they don't understand the idioms of English, of American English, then they will not necessarily be successful in college here.